The first thing Marin Solis noticed about her new shift was the silence. Not the good kind. Not the deep, pressurized quiet of a ship running clean, all systems nominal, nothing in the cargo hold but inert freight and frozen time. This was a silence with weight to it, the kind that sits just behind your teeth and won't let you swallow. She had been alone on the Ardennes for 4 months, 3 weeks and 6 days. She knew because she kept a tally on the inside of her left wrist with a marking stylus, 41 small hatch marks. Each one a morning she'd woken up to the same corroded ceiling panels, the same recycled coffee that tasted faintly of the metal it was filtered through, the same view of deep space through porthole 7 that hadn't changed in all the months she'd been awake. The stars didn't move. That was the thing people didn't warn you about. They told you about the loneliness, and the body aches from monitoring equipment for hours on end, and the strange dreams that came from too much solitude. Nobody told you that the stars didn't move. She was a field medic by training, 29 years old, compact and wireline from a childhood on Station 14, where you didn't waste calories on bulk you couldn't use. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular stubbornness, which her crewmates, when they were awake to observe it, had described with a range of colorful expressions. She'd taken the posting on the Ardennes for one reason and one reason only: the pay. 2 years of cargo runs to the outer relay stations and back, and she'd have enough to buy passage to Vila Prime. Not the simulated one, the real coordinates that the Resistance had been broadcasting for 3 years now, the ones the unified colonial authority kept jamming and re-jamming and pretending they'd already discredited. The ones her brother Tamaz had died transmitting. She didn't think about Tamaz during the day. She'd learned that much. Station 14 had been a good place to learn that kind of discipline. It was a mid-ring habitation platform in the upper orbit cluster. 8,000 residents crammed into a structure designed for 5,000, the seams of which showed in the recycling backlogs and the food rationing schedules, and the way the climate control struggled through the night cycle and left the corridors cold enough to see your breath until about an hour past morning bell. She had grown up understanding scarcity as the natural condition of things, the scarcity of space, of warmth, of good protein, of privacy, of any horizon that wasn't a curved wall. She had understood from earliest memory that the unified colonial authority's primary product was not governance or infrastructure or the steady maintenance of human civilization. Its primary product was the management of expectation. Keep people believing that what they had was what there was, and the distance between what they had and what they deserved would never become dangerous. Rhea had been the authority's masterwork in that respect. The dream planet, beautiful in every broadcast image, temperate and green and vast, a world where you could walk outside without a suit and feel actual wind from actual weather, where you could grow things in actual soil, where the horizon was real and curved away from you in the right direction. You had to be wealthy to go there, extremely wealthy, by the cramped standards of the stations, but the promise of it did something important to people who would never be wealthy enough, which was that it gave them a direction to aim, something to save for, something to tell your children about. The authority had understood for decades that hope was its own kind of cage, cleaner and more durable than any physical structure, requiring no maintenance beyond occasional broadcast updates showing smiling colonists in green fields. She had believed in Rhea until she was 24. Then Tamaz had found the transmissions. The Ardennes was a K-class heavy freighter, 32 years old and showing every one of them. The interior smelled of hydraulic fluid and carbon scoring, and something sweet and faintly biological that she'd never been able to trace. The hull had been patched in at least 60 places she could count, and the gravity plating on C-deck ran about 8% light, which meant if you walked too fast through the aft corridor, you got a half-second of weightlessness that was either charming or nauseating depending on how your inner ear felt about surprises. She had grown to find it charming. She had grown to find most things about the ship charming in the way you grew fond of anything you were trapped with long enough. She had a ritual. Every morning, ship's time, she would begin her rounds at 600, starting in the engine monitoring room where the readouts cast amber light on the walls and the hum of the Ardennes drive system was a physical thing you could feel in your molars. She would verify the readings, note any variations, log them to the day's report. Then she would move through B-deck, checking the cryo bay where her 4 crewmates lay in their pod housings, still and cold and perfectly healthy, their vital signs pulsing in slow green arcs across the monitoring panel. She had learned all their faces in the first week, the way you learned the faces of people you couldn't talk to. Marchetti, the commander, who looked in sleep like someone conducting an important meeting somewhere else entirely. Kovacs, whose dreaming face was somehow even more guarded than his waking one. Draz, who alone of them slept with a slight frown, as though the ship systems were generating problems he felt obligated to solve even in unconsciousness. The 4th crew member, Yasha, the communications officer, young enough to have a face that had not yet learned how to hold things back. She slept with an openness that Marin found, against all sense, comforting. Then cargo inspection. Then medical bay maintenance. Then the meal she made herself eat even when she wasn't hungry, because malnutrition on a solo watch shift was a documented risk, and she was a medic and knew exactly how insidious it was. Then 3 hours of reading, technical manuals mostly, which she found calming, the authoritative certainty of procedures. Then a second round of instruments. Then sleep. The routine was the architecture that held the aloneness in shape. Without it, you were just floating. She was on her rounds when she heard it. A sound from Cargo Bay 3. Not a creak, ships creaked constantly, the whole structure groaning and settling as temperature gradients shifted between the heated interior and the absolute cold pressed against the outer skin. Not a thump from shifting freight. She'd catalogued every variety of mechanical noise the Ardennes produced in the first 3 weeks of her shift, had given them names, and filed them in her memory the way a doctor files symptoms. This was something else. A scrape, rhythmic, deliberate. She stopped walking. The sound stopped. She stood in the corridor between B-deck and the cargo access ladder for 11 seconds, counting under her breath, watching the motion sensor panel on the wall. All lights green. Nothing moving in Bay 3 except the standard atmospheric circulation fans. She told herself it was the ship. She told herself it was the recycler venting through a corroded joint. She told herself she was 43 days from the end of her shift, and her brain was pattern-matching random noise into something meaningful, because that was what isolated human brains did, because evolution had never prepared the human nervous system for this particular variety of aloneness. Then she heard it again. She went back to her bunk and she sat on the edge of it with her hands flat on her thighs and she breathed. She was not afraid. That was important to establish clearly, even to herself alone in the dimness. She was not afraid. She was alert. She was processing. Those were different things. She checked the cargo manifest for Bay 3. Construction equipment. Prefabricated environmental sealing units. 17 containers of compressed mineral slurry rated for deep core drilling. All of it bound for Relay Station Golgotha, a semi-automated waypoint in the outer system that the UCA was supposedly expanding into a full habitation node. She had loaded the manifest herself before departure, had verified container weights against the ship's scale, had signed the authorization forms in triplicate with the pen that still had someone else's dried ink on the cap. Everything matched. Everything had always matched. She went to wake Sergeant Kovacs anyway. His pod was in the second cryo row on A-deck, number 7, the one with the scratch across the seal housing that looked like a bird if you squinted. He came out of cryo the way he always did, fighting it. His hands moved before his eyes opened, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, and she'd learned to step back and give him space for the first 30 seconds while his brain caught up with his body. He was a UCA security officer, assigned to the Ardennes because the colonial authority had decided that every cargo run in the outer system now required an armed escort aboard. Something to do with the resistance. Something to do with the broadcasts. They never explained the policy, just handed you a man with a sidearm and a sealed orders packet and expected you to be grateful. Kovacs was not a bad man. She had decided that in the early weeks of her solo shift, reviewing the crew files to have something to read. He was 41. He had a daughter on Station 11, age 9, who drew pictures of horses even though she had never seen one. He wrote her letters that he encrypted and queued for the next relay ping. She had not read those letters. That line she held. He sat up and blinked at her. His eyes were still filming over from the cryogel. "Solis," he said. His voice was gravel and rust. "There's something in Bay 3, she said. He didn't ask her to repeat it. She appreciated that about him. He processed fast, went straight to the operational question. "How long?" 2 hours, could be longer. I only started actively listening 2 hours ago. He was already reaching for his boots. Motion sensors. "Nothing. Could be a sensor fault. Could be, we'd still need to check." He looked at her for a moment with those carefully neutral eyes. Then he nodded once and started lacing. Bay 3 was the deepest section of the hold, accessed through a hatch that required a manual wheel turn and a pressure equalization cycle that took 45 seconds and sounded like the ship was exhaling. The lights in the bay were the cold blue-white of a working environment, not the warmer amber of the rest of the ship, and they threw hard shadows between the stacked containers. The containers were standard UCA industrial gray, stenciled with cargo codes in black. Everything exactly where it should be, exactly the weight the manifest said it was. Except for container Bay 39er in the third row back, which had been moved. Not far, 18 centimeters, maybe 20, scraped along the deck plate that bore the marks of its passage. A container rated at 1,100 kilograms didn't move itself. Kovacs saw it when she did, and his hand went to his sidearm with the unconscious precision of a man who had spent decades in situations where that was the right response. "Stay back," he said. "I'm a medic," she said. "If there's someone alive in there, you're going to need me." He considered this, nodded. They opened it together. The container wasn't full of construction equipment. It was mostly full of construction equipment. That was the thing, the careful, patient, precise cunning of it. The drilling rods and compression sealers were all there, were all real, had all been there when she loaded the manifest. But in the space behind them, in a cavity carved out of the load with enough room for a human body to fold into, there was a child. She was perhaps 8 years old. She was in a cryosleeve, a single-occupant portable unit, the civilian kind you could buy through certain gray market suppliers if you knew the right people and had enough credits and were desperate enough. The sleeve was still active. The child's vital signs showed on the small status panel clipped to the sleeve's collar. Heartbeat steady, core temperature optimal, neural activity normal. She had dark hair and a face that even in cryo-stillness had a quality of fierce concentration to it, as if she was arguing with someone in her sleep. Marin knelt beside her and checked the sleeve's integrity. It was good. The child was fine. Kovacs said behind her, "We need to report this." "To who?" Marin said, still looking at the child. "UCA Colonial Authority. Ardennes is a registered UCA freight contractor. Protocol requires immediate." "Kovacs," she turned to look at him, "who put her here?" He was quiet. "That sleeve is rated for 8 months. She's been in there since before we departed. Someone put her in that container before we loaded, which means someone had access to the Volgograd loading bay, which means someone inside the authority's own freight management chain." She paused. Why would someone inside the UCA freight chain hide a child in a cargo container on a deep run? Kovacs' face did something complicated. He was not a stupid man. He had understood the implications 30 seconds ago, probably, and was working through what they meant for him personally. For his sealed orders, for his posting, for the daughter on Station 11 who drew horses. "We still need to report it," he said, "whatever it means." "Yes," she said, "we do." She put her hand on the sleeve's release and didn't operate it yet. She just let her palm rest against the cold housing and felt the steady pulse of the sleeves pump through the metal, small and persistent, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. They agreed to wait 4 hours before transmitting. It took the relay signal 20 minutes to reach the nearest UCA node either way, so 4 hours gave them nothing operationally. It was a psychological number, the amount of time Marin needed to think, and Kovacs knew it and allowed it. She spent those 4 hours in the medical bay, running every diagnostic the ship systems could perform, checking and rechecking the child's status, and also pulling up the manifest again and sitting with it and reading it very carefully. The container bay reference code for Bay 39er corresponded to a shipment authorized by UCA Logistics Directorate under clearance code Omega 7. She had loaded it without question because Omega 7 was a standard industrial clearance, and there was nothing unusual about it. Except that when she cross-referenced the clearance code against the public registry, something she'd never thought to do before. Why would you? It was a bureaucratic check she'd never been trained to consider. The Omega 7 authorization for this specific container had been issued 48 hours before the official departure paperwork had been filed for the Ardennes. Someone had known the Ardennes was going to make this run before the run was officially scheduled. She sat with that for a while. Then she pulled up her personal message queue and found the last transmission she'd received from the Vela Prime broadcast frequency, the one she'd saved before the authorities' jammers had closed in again. Just 7 words, partially corrupted, the rest static. "Ria is not what's static. The children are static, find them." She had thought when she first received it that it was noise. Random signal interference arranged by coincidence into something that looked like language. She had not let herself think otherwise because Tamaz was dead and Hope had costs she couldn't afford. She looked at the child in the sleeve. She thought about it for a long time. Then she woke up the rest of the crew. Commander Yeva Marchetti came out of cryo with the measured, deliberate authority of a woman who had been interrupted in the middle of something important and intended to return to it. She was 54, gray-haired, originally from the Titan colonies, with the specific brand of patience that Titan upbringing seemed to produce. The patience of people who had grown up knowing that the suit either held or it didn't, and panic changed nothing either way. Marin had served under 3 commanders. Marchetti was the best. She listened to the full briefing without interrupting. Then she said, "Show me the child." They went to Bay 3. Marchetti looked at the sleeve, at the child's still face, at the manifest code Marin had printed and brought along. She held the printout for a long time. Then she said, "What does the Omega 7 authorization tell us about the point of origin?" "Loading Dock 7, Volgograd Station," Marin said. But the dock supervisor for loading Dock 7 on departure day was transferred to a different assignment 3 days later. I checked the personnel records. She's listed as currently on administrative leave pending review. No further details. Marchetti put the printout down on top of the sleeve. Someone cleaned up after themselves. "Yes. And you think this connects to the Vela Prime transmissions?" Marin had not told Marchetti about the transmission she'd saved. She had not told anyone. She said, carefully, "I think someone outside the authorities' official structure put a great deal of effort into getting this child onto this ship. That effort suggests the child matters to someone very much. The question is whether she matters to the authority or to someone the authority considers an enemy." Kovacs said from the doorway, "She could be a hostage. The Resistance has taken hostages before." "The Resistance has never taken children," Marchetti said. She said it without inflection, which meant she'd had intelligence on that point. She looked at Kovacs for a moment. "Sergeant, Give us the room." He left without argument. Marchetti waited until his footsteps faded. Then she said, "Marin, tell me what you actually know." Marin told her, all of it, the transmission, to Maz, the frequency she'd been monitoring in secret for 18 months, the 7 words. Marchetti listened and her face didn't change, and when Marin finished, there was a silence that had a different quality from the one she'd noticed at the start of her shift. This one was full, not empty. "I lost someone too," Marchetti said. "My wife, 3 years ago. She was on a transport that the authority declared a navigational accident." She paused. "There were 12 people on that transport. All of them had applied for immigration to the outer system. All of them had, in their application materials, cited the Vila Prime transmissions as the source of their information about habitable territory." Marin said nothing. "I have been on this run," Marchetti said, "for 4 years. 3 cargo runs on the Ardennes, same route, same relay waypoints. I have been watching for something. I did not know what." She looked at the child in the sleeve. "I think I may be looking at it." They held a crew meeting in the mess hall, all 4 of them. Marin, Marchetti, Kovacs, and the ship's engineer, a quiet Martian named Draz who had said perhaps 40 words to Marin in the entire previous 4 months, and seemed to find this perfectly comfortable. Marin laid out what she knew. Marchetti corroborated what she could. Kovacs sat with his hands flat on the table, and his face arranged in the expression of a man working through a very serious calculation. Draz said, "I want to see the sleeve's manufacturer stamp." They went back. Draz examined the sleeve with the thoroughness of someone who inspected machinery for a living and knew what to look for. He found the stamp and read it and straightened up and said, to no one in particular, "This is a Vila system manufacturer. I've seen this stamp before. We get them occasionally in deep system salvage, part of equipment caches left by the early survey missions." He looked at the sleeve. This sleeve was built beyond the authority's supply chain. Whatever this child's connection to Vila Prime is, it's direct. The silence in Bay 3 was complete. Kovacs said, "I need to make the relay transmission." Marchetti said, "I know. Those are my orders, standing protocols. Unknown cargo, possible security threat, report to." "Kovacs," Marchetti's voice was very quiet, "what happens to her if we report?" He didn't answer. "She gets taken off the Ardennes at the next relay point. She goes into UCA custody, and then we never hear about her again because we are freight contractors on a routine run and we have no clearance to know what the authority does with persons of interest." Marchetti paused. "Is that what your orders mean? Is that what you signed for when you took this posting?" Kovacs looked at the child for a long time. His hands were very still. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know," Marchetti said. "She's 9 years old." "I know." He picked up his sidearm from the holster he'd placed it in when he knelt to examine the container. He held it for a moment, weighing it. Then he set it down on top of a nearby container, carefully, with deliberate intent, the way you set something down when you are deciding not to use it. "What's the plan?" he said. Marin let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for the past 20 minutes. "We need to know who she is," she said. "And we need to know where she's actually supposed to go. The sleeve should have an embedded data chip with destination coordinates. I didn't want to access it without the full crew present." Draz said, "I can extract it." It took him 11 minutes. The chip was ceramic encased, passive broadcast, keyed to a specific frequency that Draz had to build a reader for from components in the engineering bay. He did it with the focused quiet of a man who had built readers for stranger frequencies in stranger conditions. When he connected it to the ship's terminal, it broadcast a single data packet. Marin read it, she read it again, she looked up at Marchetti. The coordinates were not for relay station Golgotha. They were for a location in the deep outer system, past the edge of the authority's acknowledged territory. In the sector the official charts marked as unverified, survey incomplete. The same sector that the Vela Prime transmissions claimed was home to the largest non-human intelligent structure humanity had ever encountered. The same sector that the UCA said was vacuum and rock and nothing else, had always been nothing, would always be nothing, because the alternative required a conversation that the people at the top of the authority had decided they were not ready to have. "She's not human," Draz said from the terminal. He had been running the medical diagnostic data from the sleeve's records through the ship's biological analysis software. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, as a statement of observed fact. Physiologically almost identical, but the markers are off. The cellular structure around the neural connector site, the blood chemistry. Whoever made this sleeve knew her biology well enough to keep her alive in standard cryo conditions, but she's not from the stations. She's not from Rhea. She's not from anywhere in the authorities' catalog. Marin looked at the child's still face through the sleeve's view panel. She thought about Tamaz. She thought about the 7 words. She thought about what it would mean if the authority had been lying not just about Earth's condition and Rhea's existence, and the economic data and the immigration quotas, and the transport accident that had killed Marchetti's wife, but about something so much larger that the lying about everything else was just scaffolding built to conceal it. A secret inside a secret inside a secret, nested like pressure suits inside each other, and at the innermost layer. A child. Someone had put a child in a cargo container and shipped her across the outer system on a human freight run, because it was the only way to move her without the authority detecting the transit signature of whatever drive system had brought her here in the first place. Someone had trusted humans to carry her. Marin thought, we are going to have to be worth that trust. They changed course 3 hours later. It was not a small decision. A K-class heavy freighter running an authorized cargo route didn't just change course without the authorities' nav control system flagging the deviation within 6 hours and transmitting an inquiry within 12. They would have to answer that inquiry or go dark. Going dark, cutting the transponder and the relay ping, was technically a criminal act under UCA freight law and practically a declaration that they were either dead or doing something the authority wouldn't like. They talked about it for 2 hours, the 4 of them, in the mess hall with bad coffee and the ship groaning around them. Marchetti laid out the options with the thoroughness of a commander who respected the intelligence of the people she commanded. Option 1. Report the child, file the cargo anomaly, continue to Golgotha, and hand the situation to the authority at the next relay point. She walked through what that would mean in concrete terms, the authority security team that would come aboard, the debriefings that would last weeks, the sealed records that would follow each of them for the rest of their careers. The child entering a system that had been disappearing inconvenient persons for decades. Option 2. Change course to the coordinates on the data chip, cut the transponder, and accept that their careers within the UCA system were over the moment the nav control flagged them as deviating. She walked through that too, the warrant that would be issued, the benefits that would be revoked, the fact that their faces would be added to the authority's internal security dossier, alongside the resistance broadcasters and the Luddite sympathizers and every other category of person the UCA had decided, was a threat to the careful management of expectation. Kovacs made the case for going through official channels. He made it clearly and fairly, and without pretending the risk wasn't real. His argument was that a child, even a non-human child, was still a living being in their custody, and living beings in distress had legal protections even under UCA law, and those protections could theoretically be invoked if they documented everything carefully and filed the right. Marchetti cut him off gently. Kovacs, they killed 12 people on a transport and called it a navigation accident. You know what careful documentation gets you with people like that. He was quiet for a while, then, my daughter. Yes. If I go dark on a UCA freight run, I lose my posting. I lose my benefits. She's on a station where benefits mean. I know. So tell me, he said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't controlled, that came up from somewhere underneath the sergeant's professional surface. How we make this work for her. Because I'll do it. I've made my decision, I set the weapon down, I know what I'm doing. But tell me we've thought about what it costs. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Draz said, what if the people we're going to are real? What if Vila Prime is real, the way the broadcasts have been saying for 3 years? What if there is territory outside the authority, with people in it who are living outside the system? And what if some of them used to be inside the system and used to have daughters on stations? He let that sit. Then going dark on this run isn't the end of something. It's the beginning. Kovacs looked at him for a long time. Draz looked back, patient, Martian, unhurried. Marin watched them both and felt something she hadn't expected. The precise feeling of a crew becoming itself. Not a group of professionals assigned to the same vessel by the same bureaucracy, but something more intimate and more dangerous. A unit of 4 people who had all, independently and for their own reasons, arrived at the same conclusion about the world they lived in, who were each holding a piece of a truth too large for any one of them, and were discovering that the pieces fit together. Cut the transponder, Kovacs said. I'll draft the course deviation. Draz nodded once and left the mess hall. Marchetti sat for a moment longer, looking at Marin across the table. Your brother, she said. Yes. You think he's out there? I don't know, I stopped knowing things. I'm operating on something else now. Marchetti's mouth moved in what wasn't quite a smile. That's not the worst basis for a decision in my experience. Knowing gets you certainty. The other thing gets you distance. She stood and went to the bridge. Marin sat alone in the mess hall and drank the rest of her coffee and listened to the Ardennes groan its way through another thermal adjustment cycle. And for the first time in 4 months, the silence had something in it that wasn't emptiness. It had intent. They were 2 days out from the coordinates when the sleeve began its revival cycle. Marin had not initiated it. The sleeve's own internal programming had activated automatically, built to wake its occupant when within a certain proximity of the destination signal. She'd been in Bay 3 running a routine check when the status panel began counting up through the revival sequence, and she'd stood there and watched it happen with a feeling she couldn't immediately name. Not fear. Something closer to the moment before an important examination, when you have studied everything you can study, and the rest is out of your hands. The child came out of cryo the way children came out of things, completely. No gradual surfacing, no fog. One moment still, the next. Eyes open, dark and precise, taking in the bay with the comprehensive alertness of someone who had been awake in there the whole time. She looked at Marin. Marin said in the calmest voice she possessed, "Hello, I'm a doctor, you're safe." The child didn't speak. She sat up in the sleeve, folding her legs underneath her with unconscious elegance, and looked at Marin with an expression that Marin slowly recognized as assessment. The child was evaluating her. Not from fear, the fear was there, Marin could see it, the fine tension in the small hands, the controlled breathing, but the assessment was running simultaneously, separate from the fear, processing data while the fear waited to see if it would be needed. That was a very old habit to have in a child. Marin sat down on the deck across from her so she was at eye level rather than looming. She held out her hands, palms up. The universal primate gesture, I have nothing. I am not a threat. The child looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she reached out and put one small palm against Marin's right palm, and the contact lasted about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds Marin felt something. Not pain, not quite warmth. Something that moved through her like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed, a brief brightening behind her eyes that was over before she could identify it. The child withdrew her hand. Then she spoke, not in any language Marin had encountered, not in any language the ship's translation software recognized when Marin later ran the recording through it. But the sound of it was structured, patterned, full of intention, And even without translation, Marin understood not the words which were not words, but the shape of what was being communicated. I know what you are. I know you are trying. I am afraid, but I am not running. My name is Marin, she said. The child touched her own sternum. A sound, 3 syllables, a rising tone on the last one. Marin tried to repeat it. She got it approximately right on the 3rd attempt. The child's mouth moved, which might have been the equivalent of a smile. Marin chose to interpret it that way. Over the next 2 days, they built a language of gestures and sounds and pointing and repetition and facial expressions that conveyed, approximately, the following. The child was alone on the ship because she had been sent ahead. She was an emissary of a kind. She was not the first. There had been others before her over many years, sent on various vessels, most of whom had been intercepted by the authority. Her presence on the Ardennes represented the most recent attempt in a long series of attempts to make contact with humans, who were not yet owned by the force that had decided it owned all of humanity. The child was patient, in a way that should not have been possible in a child of her apparent age. Marin had worked with pediatric patients during her field rotation on Station 6, had spent 3 months in the children's ward, and come away with a deep appreciation for the specific variety of exhaustion that came from working with small humans who had not yet learned that waiting was sometimes the right answer. This child waited. She waited with the quality of someone who had been taught, very deliberately, the strategic value of stillness. When Marin couldn't understand her and they had to circle back to gestures, she didn't show frustration. When Marin got the pronunciation of her name wrong the 8th or 9th time, she simply made the sound again, precisely, offering it without impatience like a teacher who has all the time in the world because she understands that the material matters. Marin tried to learn as much as she could. She drew on the datapad rough sketches, stick figures, diagrams, and the child responded by drawing her own, which were startlingly precise, spatial and technical in a way that implied familiarity with engineering or navigation or both. The structures she drew were not human structures, but they were recognizable as structures, as things built with intention by minds that understood load-bearing and geometry and the relationship between form and function. She drew the outside of the Ardennes accurately from memory. She had seen it, somehow, either from the container bay's external sensor feed or from some ability Marin didn't yet understand. She drew it and then drew next to it something else, something the ship's sensors had been steering around, and she looked at Marin with those precise eyes and made the sound that Marin had begun to understand meant home. The authority knew about them. That was the thing Marin kept coming back to as the picture assembled itself in pieces over those 2 days, sitting on the deck of Bay 3 with a child whose name she was still learning to pronounce, drinking bad coffee and pointing at things and making sounds. The authority had known for a long time, possibly from the very beginning of their power. Whatever was out there in the unverified sector, they had encountered it and decided that the correct response was to ensure that no one else ever did. The reassimilation, the jamming of the Vela Prime broadcasts, the disappearing dock supervisors and the transport accidents and the personnel on administrative leave. It was not paranoia or incompetence or the ordinary brutality of bureaucratic systems. It was specific. It was organized. It was the behavior of an institution that had decided the truth was a resource to be rationed, and what lived in the outer system was a truth too large to allow to circulate freely. On the morning of the 2nd day, the child reached into the cryosleeve, which she was apparently still using as a storage device, and produced something. She held it out to Marin. It was a data card, physically similar to the authority's standard format but subtly different. The casing had a different weight distribution. The contact edges were slightly wider. She pressed it into Marin's palm with the deliberate intentionality of someone who has been practicing the gesture in their imagination for a long time. Marin closed her fingers around it. They were at the coordinates the next morning. There was nothing visible from the ship's external cameras. Vacuum, the edge of the outer system, dust and silence, and the distant smear of a gas giant 300,000 kilometers away. Draz sat at navigation and ran the instruments and said, after about 10 minutes, "There's something there. The sensors are going around it, not reading it." "Going around," Marchetti said, "like a blind spot." "Like a very deliberate blind spot, yes." Kovacs was standing at the forward viewport, arms crossed, the posture of a man who has committed to a thing and is waiting for it to either vindicate him or destroy him and has made peace with either outcome. He said, "She knows we're here. The child. Whatever's out there." He was right. They knew 17 minutes later, when every screen on the bridge came alive with a transmission that bypassed the ship's communications array entirely and appeared directly on the ship's internal displays. Not audio, not video. Something else, a cascade of data that the ship's systems couldn't interpret, but the child, standing in the bridge doorway where Marin had brought her when the sensors started going strange, clearly could. She crossed to the navigation console and stood in front of it, and her hand moved over the display with a confidence and familiarity that made Marin understand, finally, that the child had been on a ship's bridge before. Many times. On ships that made this one look like a sealed tin can. The transmission resolved into something the ship systems could partially render, a three-dimensional image, rough-edged and flickering but unmistakable, a structure, enormous. Arrayed in a geometry that human engineering didn't use, not because human engineering couldn't conceive of it, but because human engineering had never had to solve for the particular gravitational dynamics that structure was managing. Around it, in orbit and at various distances, other structures. Smaller, still enormous, and at the closest approach a vessel, not an authority vessel, not anything Marin had ever seen. "Coming toward them," Kovacs said. "Are we in danger?" Marin looked at the child, who was watching the display with an expression that was not quite the fierce concentration of her cryosleep, but adjacent to it, focused, waiting. Marin said, "No." She said it before she had any concrete reason to say it, before there was any evidence that justified the certainty in her voice. She said it because of the card in her pocket, and the 2 days of gestures and pointing, and the feeling of a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. She said it because Tamaz had died for 7 words, and she had spent 18 months waiting for the rest of the sentence, and she was done waiting. The vessel that emerged from the blind spot region of space was unlike anything human engineering had produced, not because it was incomprehensibly alien, but because it was incomprehensibly patient. Every line of it spoke to timescales that made the authorities' centuries of institutional power look like a brief administrative error. It had the character of something built to last not for decades or centuries, but for a duration that didn't have a human word. It did not hail them. It came alongside the Ardennes and matched their speed with the effortless precision of a system that had been tracking their course for days, and then it waited. Marchetti said, "They're waiting for us to make a move." "Not us," Marin said. She looked at the child, her. The child was already moving toward the airlock. What happened in the next 4 hours Marin would spend years attempting to describe accurately and would never quite succeed, because the events themselves were not the thing that resisted description. The events were straightforward enough in the end. The contact protocols, the exchange of data, the cascade of information that came through the card she'd been given, translated now through equipment aboard the other vessel into something the Ardennes systems could process. The faces that appeared on the bridge display, not human, not quite, but wearing the same expressions humans wore when a very long wait was finally ending. The child standing at the center of all of it with the calm authority of someone who had been prepared for this moment from birth. The thing that resisted description was smaller than all of that. It was the moment just before the airlock cycled open, when the child stopped and turned and looked at Marin with those dark, precise eyes, and then crossed to her and placed both palms against Marin's hands again, and held them there. Longer this time. Long enough for Marin to understand that what moved through her was not a feeling, but a transfer of some kind, information packaged in a medium that bypassed language entirely, and went somewhere older and quieter in the architecture of the mind. She understood afterward that it was a gift. Not the kind of gift that could be itemized or explained, but the kind that changes the shape of the person who receives it. A door opened in a wall that had always been a wall, and through the door, briefly, the apprehension of something so vast and so present and so thoroughly unafraid that Marin's eyes filled with tears before she knew they were going to. The child withdrew her hands. She touched her own sternum, the sound 3 syllables rising tone. Then she turned and went through the airlock. The exchange lasted 4 hours. What they learned, what they were told in data packets and direct transmission, and the careful patient translation of beings who had been communicating across impossible distances for longer than humanity had had language, was this. The Authority had known for 60 years. The first contact had happened before Marin's parents were born, in the outer system, a survey vessel that had wandered into the unverified sector, and found something that the survey team had reported back with shaking hands and voices they couldn't keep level. The Authority at the time had been smaller, newer, more frightened of its own power, and the decision they had made in the months following that first contact had been made from fear rather than malice. The decision was, not yet. Humanity was not ready. The stations were overcrowded, and the politics were unstable, and the memory of Earth's collapse was still raw. And introducing into that situation the knowledge that you were not alone in the universe, that you had never been alone, that the beings who had watched your civilization's birth and were watching your civilization's crisis had opinions and suggestions and technologies that made yours look approximate, would destabilize everything. Not yet. Not yet had become the Authority's founding principle. Not yet had calcified over 60 years into never, and never had required infrastructure to sustain it. The reassimilation, built on a captured piece of alien engineering that the Authority's technicians had spent 2 decades imperfectly reverse engineering, designed to give people hope without giving them the specific hope that involved contact with anyone outside the Authority's control. The jamming stations, the disappearing transport manifests. Tamaz and 12 other people on a transport that the navigational record showed had made a 90-degree course correction into the path of a debris field, at a time when the AI navigation system should have avoided it automatically. The beings in the outer system had known. They had been patient. They had tried, many times, many ways to open a door. The broadcasts, the data drops, the children sent in cargo sleeves on human freight runs, because their small forms and harmless presentation were the only package a terrified Authority might let pass if they weren't watching closely enough. They had been trying to send a message that the Authority couldn't intercept, which meant finding humans who were already outside the Authority's trust, humans who had reasons of their own to look in directions the Authority didn't want them looking, humans who were carrying grief like a compass and had enough stubbornness in them to follow it. They had found 4 such humans on a K-class freighter that smelled of hydraulic fluid and carbon scoring, and something sweet and faintly biological that was, Draz pointed out when the data packets were analyzed, a trace compound used as a calibration medium in alien sensor equipment. The ship had not been a random selection. The Ardennes had been chosen. They had been watched. The sleeve in Bay 3 had been placed knowing that the right person would be awake for the right shift, with the right grief and the right stubbornness, and the right habit of listening to sounds that didn't fit. Marin sat with that for a long time. The data card held something else too, which she didn't discover until the first exchange was over and the child had returned through the airlock, and the other vessel had withdrawn to its orbit near the structures, waiting. In a separate partition, sealed with a key that she had apparently been given through the palm contact without knowing it, was a list. Names, hundreds of them. The names of humans who had reached the outer system by various means and were living, now, in communities outside the authorities' knowledge. Some of them in habitats the alien civilization had quietly assisted in establishing over the decades of not yet. Some of them in the outer system's natural structures, asteroid-dug and self-sustaining. A network of people who had made it out, who were building something that did not require the reassimilation, and did not require the UCA's permission, and did not require the pretense that humanity's only options were the overcrowded stations or an expensive fare to a planet that didn't exist. Partway down the list, in a section marked Most Recent, a name she knew. She looked at it for a long time. Her vision blurred, she blinked. Tomás Solis, Station 7 Outer Community Registry 4471, status, active. She made a sound she hadn't planned to make. Kovacs, who had been reading the data feed over her shoulder for the past 10 minutes, put a hand briefly on her shoulder and then removed it without comment. He was a good man. She had known that from the personnel file, from the letters to the daughter who drew horses. She had not known until this moment how good. The daughter, she said, when she could speak normally again. What? Your daughter, Station 11. There are ways according to this. Quiet transits, people who do it. She looked at him. She doesn't have to stay there. He looked at the list for a very long time. Then he looked at the viewport and the distant shape of the alien vessel holding its patient orbit. And then he looked at Marin, and his face had the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has just decided he doesn't have to anymore. Tell me how it works, he said. What happened after that was not a revolution. Revolutions were loud and visible, and the authority had spent 60 years getting very good at ending loud visible things before they could build momentum. What happened after was something quieter and more durable than a revolution. It was information, moving through the channels that information always finds when enough people need it badly enough. The data card, the list. The transmission protocols that the beings in the outer system had spent decades refining for exactly this purpose, designed to travel through relay networks in partitioned fragments that looked individually like noise, but assembled, in the right hands, into a complete picture. The Ardennes never made it to relay station Golgotha. Instead, it made a series of stops at coordinates that weren't on any official chart. At each stop, something was exchanged. Data, mostly. Sometimes people, individuals who had been waiting for exactly this kind of transit, who had been living at the edges of the authorities' administrative attention with their bags already packed. The ship got fuller and louder and smelled different, and Marin found that she didn't mind. At the second stop, a woman came aboard with 2 children and a small bag that held everything she owned. She had been a logistics analyst on Station 9, the kind of low-ranking bureaucratic position that gave you just enough access to shipping records to notice, over time, patterns that shouldn't have been there. Containers routed through channels that didn't correspond to any listed cargo. Personnel transfers that coincided with resistance broadcast interceptions. She had noticed, and she had started keeping records, and 3 months ago the records had gotten her fired. She had been waiting in a maintenance alcove on an abandoned relay buoy for 9 days, surviving on emergency rations, when the Ardennes transponderless silhouette appeared in her viewport. I didn't know if you were rescue or authority, she said, sitting in the mess hall with a cup of the bad coffee in hands that had finally stopped shaking. I decided it didn't matter. Either way, I wasn't staying in that alcove. At the third stop, an old man who had been a teacher on one of the Titan platforms. He had taught children about Earth, real Earth, historical Earth, the planet as it had been before the collapse. And he had been the kind of teacher who told the truth about things, which meant he had also taught them about the collapse itself, about the decisions that had led to it, about the specific people who had made those decisions and the specific systems that had enabled them. He had drawn a straight line from those systems to the authorities' current governance model, and he had drawn it in a classroom full of 12-year-olds who had gone home and told their parents. He had lost his teaching credential 14 months later. He didn't seem bitter about it. He seemed like a man who had done the thing he knew was right and was at peace with what it cost, which Marin recognized as a specific variety of courage because it was the same variety Tamaz had carried. At each stop, the data card's contents grew, names added to the list, coordinates refined, the network of people outside the authorities' knowledge expanding with each transmission, each handoff, each quiet transit from one edge of the map system to another. Marin realized after the fourth stop that the Ardennes had become a node, not a warship, not a flagship, not anything dramatic or heroic in the way the old stories about resistance movements like to imagine. A node. A point in a network of trust, carrying information and people through a dark region that the authorities' instruments were designed to ignore. Marchetti ran the ship with the same measured authority she'd brought to the regular cargo runs, which was perhaps the thing that impressed Marin most about her. The crisis had not changed Marchetti. It had revealed the thing Marchetti had always been. Underneath the UCA contractor's uniform and the filed reports and the routine adherence to protocol. A woman who had been waiting 4 years for the moment when the protocol and the right thing stopped being the same thing, and who was ready when that moment arrived. Kovacs drafted 18 letters to his daughter in the first week after they went dark. Marin knew because she counted the encrypted files in the transmission queue. He couldn't send them. The relay network would have given their position away. So he wrote them and encrypted them and queued them for a future that didn't exist yet. A future in which there was a way to reach Station 11 that didn't run through the authorities' communication infrastructure. He was writing letters to a child he couldn't contact, in a system that might never deliver them, and he wrote them every day anyway. Marin understood that this was not futility. This was the thing that kept him functional, the act of writing to someone he loved, addressed to a future he was building by the act of believing in it. Draz maintained the ship. He did not make speeches or draft letters or have visible emotional responses to the enormity of what they were doing. He kept the engines running and the life support calibrated, and the gravity plating on C-deck at its usual 8% light eccentricity. And when the third group of passengers came aboard, and the water recycler started struggling with the additional load, he spent 14 hours in the mechanical crawlspace, rerouting the secondary filtration circuit to handle the extra demand. He emerged covered in coolant and smelling of solvents and said, "Fixed it." Then he ate something and went asleep. Marin loved all of them. She realized this without ceremony, somewhere between the fourth stop and the fifth, in the mess hall with coffee that was finally running low, surrounded by people who were talking to each other in the way that people talked when they were no longer alone. She loved the crew she'd been given, and the passengers they'd collected, and the battered old ship that creaked and groaned and smelled of hydraulic fluid and alien sensor calibration medium. And she loved the child who had started it all, who was sitting in the corner of the mess hall drawing structures on a datapad with a focus that was fierce and completely at home. She thought about what the gift had felt like, the brief apprehension of something vast and present and unafraid. She thought about it not because she could hold on to it. It faded the way dreams faded, leaving only an impression of scale, but because it had changed something structural in how she understood the situation she was in. She had spent 4 years since Tamaz's death treating it as a wound, a specific point of damage that she carried and tried not to press on. What the child had given her was not the information that Tamaz was alive, though that was part of it. It was something prior to that, the understanding that the universe she was moving through was not indifferent, that what looked like silence from inside the authorities' noise was not absence. It was patience, a patience she couldn't fully comprehend, waiting at the outer edge of everything she'd known, speaking in frequencies the authorities' jammers couldn't find because they were built to block human signals, and these were something older. And it had been waiting, the way the stars didn't move, with a quality of attention that made her chest ache. Draz came and stood next to her at Porthole 7 on the last morning before they reached the first community on the list. He stood there for a while without saying anything, which was his version of company. "You believe it now," he said eventually. "All of it." "Yes," she said. "The broadcasts, the outer system, the thing the girl gave you." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "I never had any trouble believing it. I grew up on Mars." When you grow up on Mars, you already know the inner system is lying to you. It makes it easier to believe someone else might be telling the truth. The stars hadn't moved. They would never move, not at any speed she could achieve, not in any time she had. But she was looking at them differently now, through the same scratched porthole she'd been looking through for months, and they looked different back. Not still, not static, waiting. She put her hand on the glass. She thought, "We are out here. We are coming. We are stubborn and grieving and imperfectly brave, and we are coming. And whatever you built out there in the patient dark, we are going to be worth finding." The stars didn't move. But the Ardennes did.